Hey, you're laughing for a reason. Holy smokes. This was set up to fail. I quit. So building better vendor relationships starts way before you sign the contract. It starts with picking the right one, choosing a vendor without fully checking out what they offer, what they're good at and not so good at, and how they compare to others can lead to big problems down the road. You've got to know what you're getting into before you start working with them. So we're going to help you figure out how to choose vendors wisely. We'll talk about, how to ask the right questions, compare options, and make sure your vendor can be a real partner and not a risk. So AFTAB, what's the first thing you think about when it comes to vendor selection?
The first thing is defining your criteria for the selection process, right? So really reflecting or understanding the criteria that's most relevant to your business, and depending on the vertical you're in, right? Certain compliances may weigh heavily into this, right? So if you're in certain verticals, maybe the vendor has to ask certification A, certification B, certification C, etc. So that's important. The other portion of it that's important to me is, and I think you and I may have chatted about this just casually, certain key portions of our infrastructure or key components of our security stack, the vendor has to meet a certain minimum threshold in terms of longevity, in terms of reputation, in terms of revenue. I mean, there's certain key vendors that, hey, as much as I love startups and I love working with them, there's just certain areas that I just can't. That area I just couldn't do a startup in. Mm-hmm. So the vendor reputation, size, etc. Then the other portion of it, and I'm going to maybe contradict myself here because I have some strong opinions about the vendor questionnaires. I mean, there's value in that, and I do think that is an important process to go through. However, I do believe we as a industry has made it more complicated than it needs to be. So I do agree with the fundamental premise that we need to have vendor questionnaires and audits and such. I think that the way we're doing it today, there's a huge opportunity to help make that a lot easier on both sides. Mm-hmm. Having been on both sides, it's a nightmare, but it's important. So don't get me wrong. And then what I personally actually very much attached to with the vendor is having key relationships as well. So if it's a key security vendor, I have to have line of sight to the C-suite. I have to have some interaction with the top leadership, not because I want to rub elbows. Look, I'm always open to building good relationships, but I want to make sure that they value us as a customer and they're willing to truly meet us where we need in terms of support when that moment comes. I don't want to, and I've been on the short end of this many times. I don't want to get into a scenario where we have a security tool that has faltered or is deficient, and you reach out to the teams to go execute and fix, and they come back to you like, well, it's the deficiency or the problem with the vendor, and we have no recourse. I have no recourse. I can escalate it within the sales organization, and my experience for the most part is they'll try their best, but at the end of the day, I need action. And unless I have that, look, I'm going to call your CISO or your CFO or whoever, CTO, or text he or she to then ask or share with them, this is a problem, this needs to get fixed ASAP. And I'll give you a quick example where this came and really benefited me. We had rolled out a solution at my previous firm, and when we rolled it out, we were actually one of their larger deployments for a certain region. I don't want to say too much specifics out of sensitivity for that organization. But because we rolled out the technology in a certain area, they didn't have enough coverage in terms of their POP coverage there to where they were able to service our business in that area. Fast forward, we overlooked it during the vendor selection process. We were fine with it. We were given assurances that everything will be fine. Fast forward about 6 to 8 months, things weren't fine. We had a ton of issues related to their service. It became super problematic for us because it was having an impact on our business and our users. And the conversations that I was having from my leadership was, you guys need to fix this. You know how easy that was to fix? I called up their CTO and I said, hey, such and such. This is what we're dealing with. I know this is an area you guys have articulated to us that this is an area that you guys are working to rectify. Can you accelerate that? Sure enough, he said, absolutely. Within a matter of weeks, they reprioritized things internally and they were able to service our business. So I'm not saying that that moment will come for every vendor that I work with or every vendor that I partner with, but I have realized that it's very important to ensure that during that cycle, I need a line of sight or I need some level of interaction with this, not because, and I'm not a person who believes that I'm going to call this the leadership at a drop of a dime. No, I think that is kind of the bad call, calling Batman in extreme circumstances, but that is super important. And on the flip side, that same CTO called me and said, hey, we need some partnership from you for some new service that they're rolling out. Would you be open to be a beta customer? Right. So there's definitely a give and take. Don't get me wrong. It's not like pull, but that's another portion for me that's super important when you talk about vendor selection. Not just having the long-term relationships, but having the right relationships and having both sides value the relationship. So those would be some of the areas, and like I said, I can chime in specifically on the questionnaires that I think we as an industry have kind of made a huge business out of that I think could be streamlined a bit.
Oh, we used to have over 2,000 a year.
That's
and
right.
My group, when I was running that, it was significant, and I see it across the board because I keep up with the number of people in the space.
Right.
I mean, we're talking about an information passed back and forth because it's a best effort because of the fact of the volume. The sheer volume that's associated with it.
What? So, and I would love to hear your opinion on it. You're probably more versed on it than I am. Why? I did this thing a couple of years ago. I looked at all of our security questionnaires that we were asked as a vendor, and we kind of cataloged it in a system, and we used it for future responses and RFPs and things of that nature. And I asked myself, how many of these are overlapping but just asked differently, right? And there was a high percentage. And I kept saying, well, if they would have asked that question like this, we could have saved us a ton of time. They would have got the exact same answer. So do you think there could be an attempt for us to standardize some of this stuff or agree? We have open source software where you're like, hey,
right.
Like OpenSSL, everyone uses, and it's okay. Could there be some? Hey, let's all as a community agree that these are the open source questions or something to that extent where we can alleviate this overhead, because I do think it's gotten out of control. I respect it, and I think it's necessary, but to the extent that we've gotten to, I don't know. I struggle to see the value more so than just everyone's here turning their wheels because you feel as if you're making progress, but I don't know if we actually are.
Right. I mean, there are attempts at standardization, right? There's the SIG, right? Which is basically a standardized information, collection, right? And it's upwards of, they've got light and full, and there's a bunch of different ways that people are attempting to glean detail or data from any vendor that they do. But if we really and when I take a step back, I would like that operationally. I think there might be value to it, but your risk is different than customer B or customer C risk. So when it comes down to from a question delivery mechanism and answer, we're in the world of information security.
Okay.
The general definition is trust but verify.
Sure.
Right? So we're going to get some questionnaire back, and generally the process is going to be, okay, they answered these questions, right? And they met. And somebody's going to look and say, okay, if it's standardized, right, with a drop down of yes, no, not applicable and requires a comments, let's look at the no's, let's look at the not applicables. But are we looking at the yeses? Yes. Right? It's an imperfect system. There are certainly plenty of opportunities. And so that's on the person that is, the company that's giving the questionnaire, and what's coming back then, right? What's coming back? Someone is reviewing it. Right. That reviewing process is, are we meeting everything that we need to meet? And are risks being covered? Because we have to find the corrective, the detective, and the protective controls for the risk that we are encroaching with. What you were talking about would be a strategic partnership, right? If we look at our vendors as strategic partnerships, especially in that key tier, That's where I think that it becomes much more important to have the relationships that are beyond, right? So as we go through this selection criteria, number one, what are we trying to achieve? We've decided on this category or these few vendors. We've narrowed it down. Now are we doing proof of concept, right? Because anybody in a lot of cases can say, yes, we can solve all of these problems for you, but can you prove it? And can you prove it at scale? So if we get into some type of assessment activity and that assessment activity is 1/10 the size of the scale that you need in your organization, do we feel good enough about being able to extend this out? So that comes down to, okay, do we have the relationships like you were talking about above and beyond? Do we have not necessarily the call Batman, like you call it, right? To call the CTO. I mean, when it comes down to the strategic partnership, businesses want to do the right things for their customers. And this happens across the space, but because we're, in the CISO circle here and we know that there's going to be a lot of things that we don't own, we focus on the things that we do, right? The key critical infrastructure, the third-party vendors that we're bringing in to uphold our security strategy, maintaining the fiduciary responsibility that we have as a business and as, officers of the business and what have you. It's to get to a security questionnaire crossing off all risks. I don't believe it exists. I think it's a best effort with volume, but it comes down to relationship, contract. It also comes down to what are we really achieving with this strategic partnership and how are we going to work through any risks and issues so that you have clauses that are protecting yourself.
Right, sure.
Because let's be frank, technology is going to have times that it doesn't work, from patching and anything else. It's not the issues that you run into, it's how you recover from those issues and how you respond to those issues when they're identified. I mean, you think about everyone in the world uses Microsoft. Microsoft has had plenty of issues.
Correct.
You look at any vendor, right? We're talking at massive scale here.
Sure.
But any vendor is going to, it's the world of software, right? It's going to have issues. I do think the long-term relationship, I think having quarterly business reviews.
That's a huge one, correct.
It's enormous. You need to be able to identify the product and the platform or the outcomes that you purchase the platform for, whatever we're talking about, the services that we're getting from this vendor, if it's an MDR service specifically or whatever the case may be. A QBR is key to making sure, number one, that strategic relationship exists, that you have the context of being able to identify that it's operating as expected, to be able to handle any issues or risks that have been identified, and to be able to work through what's next in this iteration. How do we continue to grow? How do we continue to mature? And what a better way to do that than work and have that vendor relationship. When those are ignored, I think it's a breakdown on both sides.
Both sides, sure, that's
right.
Yeah. No, I do agree. My point was more specifically around just the overhead that does come from just specifically the question. Just because the other portion of it, I think you and I are aligned. My contention with that is effort worth. If all the effort put in on both sides, are we getting what we ultimately want? And that's where organizations are getting what they want, but at what cost?
At what cost?
Right. And that's why I believe, and again, I think we can challenge ourselves to find a more creative way. And maybe the solution that I offered isn't the way. I
think about trust pages, right?
Yeah.
So most vendors that are in this space are going to have a SOC audit.
Correct.
They're going to have ISO certifications. If there's privacy components to it, they're going to have
those, right?
Any type of privacy certification, or there's so many different ways that kind of, without unfolding all of those. You've got PCI ROCs, or AOCs. You've got so many different things and frameworks and third-party audits, right, that we're going to say, and outside of the SOC report, let's just say it's a general third-party audit of a framework that we're trying to follow to protect customer data and maintain availability, confidentiality, integrity, etc. Right? So we go through that entire process. Now, as a CISO, and operating in that security space, owning this, I've never found that to be satisfactory because there are still questions that need to be answered. So that's where the questionnaires come in, and even in the challenging world of talking to third-party auditors that are exercising on this act, activity that they're doing because of that right to audit clause. I would love to see a standardized approach come together and work. I've yet to see a groundswell of support for that activity.
Well, that's the deficiency though.
And right. And so in the circles that we're, communicating in and running with, it seems to be like for all of the things that are taking place, how do you prioritize and get this together so that there is a standard that then everyone agrees that is aligned with the risk that presents to that business, because risk is assessed differently based on risk tolerance and everything else. And, it's just, this problem is a significant one. And I would go so far as to say in this day and age, if it was something that was solvable, it would very likely already be solved. Yeah,
I think it's worth someone looking at. Maybe one day someone will, but I do question the amount of time my teams I've spent.
It's tremendous because it hits more than security. It'll be legal. It'll be if you're a software company is going to the product teams. It's you can assemble a general sense of what your body of knowledge is. Yeah, and also keeping up with the changes.
Agreed. Then let me ask you this. Maybe you'll disagree with me, but this is the 80-20 rule, though. Mm-hmm. Don't you think? Like 80% of the questions would be pretty similar for us.
Hopefully,
and then we can noodle on the 20% that's unique for you. So even something to that, like some marginal progress here to even get us to some, even if we agree these are the 50 questions you're going to get from every single vendor or every single questionnaire, and the remaining 50 are going to be specifics for organization A, B, and B. That maybe would be in the right direction, but the way that it's done today is just an enormous amount of time, and it's, I don't know, I struggle with, and I could be wrong, I just struggle with how, is a juice worth the squeeze?
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I mean, again, it's a trust but verify, because I would contractually is where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah, and that's a good point.
Does a questionnaire sit from if it was completed? And this might be a question for any legal folks that are watching the show.
Right.
Is are the questions that are responded to best effort enough, and does that stand up to if there was a misrepresentation?
Correct.
That's right, because
and that's
at the point in time when we're talking about the art, I mean, and this really comes down to it is the art of vendor selection. Yeah. I mean, it's not an easy thing to solve for, only based on the fact that the risk is very unique to every organization in a lot of cases. I think your 80-20 rule is right to some extent, but we still have to say, okay, well, this came back and they said, yes, they do this. And hopefully it's tied to a third-party assessment that we can say, okay,
it was a validation.
We're good.
Yes.
For at least our risk tolerance. I think in other cases for very distinct applications and platforms and services, we've got to go a little bit further in that, but then that comes down to the time, effort, and energy and costs that's associated with it. So the strategic partnership is key.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Because that's where it's you can really identify, and I think it's interesting. Like you called out the element of, do we go with a startup or a vendor that's 5 years or less in age? Mm-hmm. I think that's a hard decision in a lot of cases. It's obviously there's plenty of startups that survive,
sure,
and there's plenty of M&A activity that gets absorbed into bigger organizations and may have them operate independently. But when it really comes down to to your point is when things go wrong, is there enough people? Is there enough focus on you as a key customer to make things right in an appreciable amount of time?
Right.
And it's a tough scenario. I've personally never worked for a startup. In a lot of cases, procurement. All right, if we can cycle this back, I do think that it's a trust but verify. Right. It's you need to identify, no different than any other risk in the organization that you're trying to manage, what's the most important.
Yeah.
And even if it is not a massive exercise, right? Because it is a volume issue, it is a cost issue. It's how do we get to the end of the road with at least enough information that we feel comfortable with in some validation that we can do, right?
Yeah. One, and I won't belabor the point, but could we look at it differently too than look at the procurement teams or other teams to maybe take on some of it, right? As well, to say that, hey, these are some areas that concern us, but it's not to the point where we should be involved, but you guys should definitely be.
Well, I think that's key, right? Is it a security requirement, or is it become, procurement teams depending on size,
Correct.
legal teams depending on, and that's where I really think
Yeah.
it does come down to the contract basis of what is that legal, what within these four corners, what are we required to support and
right.
what are the positions? Because the biggest thing is too when it comes down to the vendor management side, we're talking very high level here about we're doing key stakeholders, we're identifying some of that relationship and the strategic partnership that we need to have. But what we're not focusing on in a lot of these cases is what is the risk to potential data if we're sharing data.
Correct.
In the security space, it doesn't happen too often.
Sure.
Right? It doesn't. Outside of the managed detection response, but if we're talking about vendors outside now where security is all of a sudden getting involved,
right.
Where do we start and how far do we go? And that could go back into the categorization of what we're looking at.
Yeah,
where are the key vendors? What is the risk to the business? What is the impact to the business? The risk tolerance, the data that we're sharing with them, et cetera, that's going to drive how far do we need to go. And then it has to be supported, of course, across the organization. But it is an art.
Yeah,
right?
it is.
This is not Streamline, as we're both sitting here talking about the element of questionnaire chaos.
100%. It's definitely an art form. So if this podcast were a movie, Swordfish would be the director, producer, stunt double. They're the team behind the magic, working with B2B companies to create shows just like this one. Interested in co-hosting the next season of this show? Or maybe your CMO is thinking about launching a show for your company. Either way, if you want to create the top 1% of B2B content, go to sweetfishmedia.com and book a call.
So it's time for our research roundup segment here, where we take a closer look at some data that caught our attention. So today's insight comes from my company again, Varonis. It's from original research titled The Great SaaS Data Exposure. So according to the report, the average company has 157,000 sensitive records exposed to everyone on the internet via SaaS sharing features. That represents about $28 million in data breach risk. So what are your thoughts on this?
Wow.
I mean, that's 157,000 sensitive records exposed to everyone on the internet via SaaS sharing features. So these are things, if you start looking at any SaaS application that has some collaborative function that is sharing data and can do it through, let's call it Google and Box and Salesforce. I mean, Salesforce has had some, certain exposures that have been identified and of course has some opportunity there. But nonetheless, that's representing about $28 million in data breaches. That gets all boiled down into a cost per record. But nonetheless, when you start thinking about going back to the element of the art of vendor selection, there's a little bit of sharing on both sides of where does that shared responsibility model kind of fall in, and what is responsible for the organization versus the vendor, right?
No, this is important, and to kind of bring this circle back, because it's important because to set the right expectation in terms of what you said, our responsibility, your responsibility. And I think from a security team's standpoint, and just from a CISO, I think you really have to have a really good understanding of full life cycle of a vendor, similar to like an identity. Walk through that. And maybe, you don't have to necessarily do it systematically. We'll walk through what that potential would look like if, in fact, there was an exposure, and how does that impact your business. So that would be the first thing that comes to mind. The other part, and I think this is something that maybe is a little more subtle, but this is something that I think has to also be weighed in, is there's a delicate balance. Like you can't, one extreme is we don't use them and use any vendor, and the other extreme is well where we're the Wild West, right? And so what's that delicate balance? And I've struggled in some organizations that I've been a part of to find what that delicate balance is, because, for example, we had a scenario in which an inside sales team had wanted to gamify their inside sales reps. We're like, okay, no worries, go for it. I don't know what that means, but if that's what you guys want to do, go. Well, what that meant was they wanted to buy a tool that created a dashboard for all their inside sales rep, and they started gamifying, like who did the most calls, and so there's a whole host of activities. And long story short, they felt that this is what they needed to motivate our inside sales function. What we come to find out, this tool, when purchased, required all of this sensitive customer data. So now it was a question of, okay, how do we balance the fact that the senior sales leadership was fully committed to this? Our leadership wanted it. They felt they made a really compelling case that this will have a dramatic impact to revenue. But we weren't comfortable because it was a newer company. We weren't as comfortable of just signing over some of the data. We were basically signing over the data, signing over to allow us to interface with this vendor. And so that was a lesson learned for me, was really around really understanding how to balance that. Mm. And so what we ended up doing, and I don't know if there was a right approach, is we ended up spending some time with this company to then say, what specific parts of your tool do you guys, are we actually using? And what are the specific data sets you need for that? Had we gone through our normal process, this vendor would have failed. But being able to find that delicate balance specifically around that. And then we were able to kind of limit our exposure, because there was some data that they used and they needed, but we felt comfortable enough to then say, okay, I know in your normal request for data for an org to set up your app, you want this whole host of the records. And we ended up giving them a subset of the record. So I remember it very, because I felt like it was a really good partnership across our organization, across the sales teams, across the vendors themselves, who initially said it couldn't be done. They're like, no, that's not the way it works. You give us this type of an account, you send us this data, but no, actually, I thought we had some very fruitful conversations of why we had concerns around it, and I think on the sales side, they actually became an advocate for us, because we weren't trying to limit their ability to consume this product. We were just doing the best. We were doing what was in the best security interests of the company by also allowing them to consume it. So that's another portion of it. And so now, coming back to the statistic that you shared, okay, worst case scenario, smaller vendors, they're compromised and there's a breach. Okay, I think I thought we did a relatively good job of minimizing what our exposure would have been from that standpoint. Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of this also is not only about just understanding the tool, et cetera, but in some cases, being flexible enough to, and on both sides, it took not only just us, but the vendor to be open to it. Because like I said, initially there was like, no, maybe this is not a good fit, to then find creative solutions to ultimately find a way to enable the business, right? Mm-hmm. So I think there's opportunities there, having a very proactive data measurement, like, what does that mean? I think from an incident response perspective, make sure you have some good detections in place. And then, I think we shared this, you had this conversation earlier around ensuring that we have some muscle memory built for our response with that vendor, right? So make sure that, if there is an incident, or if there is a scenario in which there is a compromise, or we need to, relay information from them or vice versa, it's a very streamlined process. They know, they understand what the expectations are, the SLAs are, and so do we. So those are the two things that kind of highlight, that come to mind in terms of, sharing of that statistic. But $28 million, that's a...
Yeah, I mean, that's a breach report's when you start to build this down, right? It's some percentage of the business. It's how do you monetize, at the very least, or evaluate some financial impact? And that's going to be different for every organization, just based on what their total revenue amount is, the type of data that they have, et cetera. The biggest thing that I think when it comes down to at least what this research says to me, it's a function of understanding what SaaS applications or cloud-based storage applications, let's call them, like anything that's housing amount of data that allows collaboration. So collaborative tools, to be simple.
Yeah.
What data is there? How is it being shared? What is it? What is the density of the data that we have? Who's utilizing it? Having the full scale visibility of the access, the usage of it gives you a much better position at the very least to control it, right? And that comes with just the general, as we've talked about, this art of vendor management. It's really understanding some of the most well-known and respected and large vendors that are in the space have some of this capability. Yeah. But most organizations don't have the visibility into it. Sure. Right? Because it's a third party. It's a third party now, and all of a sudden it's, even though there's a shared responsibility model, do we have any ability, even natively, or through any third parties that would come in and do this level of security that I think is going to have an impact on capability for visibility, which will allow for measurement and action.
Right. Yeah. That's fair.
And that's key for it.
Yeah.
That's key for it. All right, so let's move into
what are we doing now?
our final segment, which, as we close out all of our episodes here, it is time to play a little game. So today we're going to play What's Worse. So here's how it works. I'll kick things off with 2 nightmare cybersecurity scenarios. And Tab, you are going to decide which one you'd rather deal with.
Neither.
Yeah, right. And then you'd have to say why. So neither is a great answer, and I think our audience will appreciate that and probably laugh right along with you.
Yeah.
So we're going to obviously do this, and I'll probably have the same answer of neither.
Sure.
And you're going to give me 2 scenarios to choose
Okay.
from. All right. So you ready?
Ready. Let's do it.
You are ready. All right. So let's do it. Scenario 1.
Okay.
Imagine a phishing attack hits your company.
All right.
And half of your employees unknowingly give up their login credentials. You now have half of your company gives up their login credentials, and you now have compromised access points all over, and it's a race against the clock to regain control. Or you suddenly find out a critical vulnerability in your main database has been exposed, giving attackers access to sensitive customer data, and it's been open for weeks. Which one would you rather handle, and why?
Do I want my left hand or right hand? I'm going with the login compromise. If reasons being that the login compromise doesn't inherently mean that your data was compromised.
That's right.
So for me, okay, you know what? I can log everyone's account, methodically go through a process to limit that. But if a database with customer data isn't compromised, means I have a bigger problem. So for me, the first scenario would be.
As I was reading them, I was thinking the same thing. I'm like, this seems recoverable. This other one has a lot of unknowns, and you really have to hope for a lot of different tool sets and telemetries and time. And now you're going to your incident response retainer generally in that type of scenario, and get forensics.
Correct. And at that point, I mean, the second scenario, you're already compromised. But in the first scenario, look, it's not ideal by no stretch of the imagination. But however, if you do have some defense in depth items put in place, there's a lot of knobs that you can still pull, things that you can still do to hopefully mitigate any potential breach. So, the first one, anytime you get my customer data or sensitive data,
it's a problem.
It's a problem. Okay.
All right. I'm not looking forward to this.
All right. Yeah. You know what? Hey,
as much of
you
a
ready?
game,
You ready for this?
You got put on the spot first, and now here's my turn.
All right, Scott. Here's a couple scenarios for you, my friend.
Right.
Okay. Your company's backup fails during a ransomware attack. Okay. Meaning there's no quick recovery for your data. Okay. Or scenario 2, a major insider threat has leaked confidential company information to a competitor, and you only find out after it's been circulating for a week. Which one would you rather deal with?
I mean, this is like, you're laughing for a reason, right? You had at least you had a lever to pull. I've got no lever to pull here. Holy smokes! All right, well, I'm going to go with the backup fails.
Really?
I am. Only based on if the insider threat, it's never limited to just a competitor, right? I mean, I might be extracting a little bit more. So a backup fails during a ransomware attack, and I'm going to take some liberty here. Okay. It's not end to end. It's not across the entire organization. We've got a tool in place that found it and stopped it in its approach of how deep and far it got. So devil's in the details here. So I'm filling in the details.
Okay. Was that part of the game?
It is now. It is now because of these types of scenarios. And for those playing at home, most certainly I hope that if you're given these same scenarios, you can fill in the details because it's not always this crystal clear. That being said, there's no quick recovery option. I'm going to come from an organization that has good visibility over our sensitive data, has it locked down to the right people, understands the usage, and I would be able to go back to some forensics log and be very distinct and specific around what the materiality of this breach is. I've got a good incident response team as well as a managed data detection response team that's around and supporting my organization. And by that essence itself, I'm going to say that has less damage than a competitor taking confidential company information and circulating it, because I'm going to suggest that I can't control beyond that, at least within the ransomware type of scenario. If the data didn't get exfiltrated, I've got some control.
Okay.
And I could be completely wrong.
Yeah,
This was set up to fail. I quit.
Okay. All right. You know what? At first, I actually was leaning toward the latter.
Yeah.
Like, a competitor, okay, maybe, we can quantify it by saying, okay, sensitive data, what does that mean?
What does that mean, right?
Right. Could it just be, okay, our roadmap for the next quarter or two? Okay, chances they're going to find that stuff out anyways. Some proprietary code. Now, that would be a little bit different. Obviously, I wouldn't necessarily wish that on anyone. So the devil's in the details there. So I was actually leaning toward the latter, actually.
I was first.
Okay.
I was at first, but that's where I started to fill in my own details.
Yeah, okay,
right. I mean,
yeah,
this is key because at the end of the day, if I've got all these other things in place, we were sitting here, talking about the ideal scenario. So in the ideal scenario, I don't want to have a competitive disadvantage when I've got control over my security estate because we've got all these lovely things that we've been saying are the panacea essentially of what a good security program or what a good round security program with no limitations whatsoever would have, and that's the world I'm gonna operate in.
So, and maybe I'm coming from a place of scar tissue because I actually had the first scenario play out, and because we had a good backup, we were able to really limit our risk.
Limit the risk. Yeah.
So,
no, it's a significant one.
Yeah,
so like
yeah,
I said,
yeah.
I added a lot of salt and pepper on it.
So cool.
To fit my answer.
It's
So
fun.
forgive me, audience, or forgive me.
No, that's
all right.
totally
So
cool. That's
that's how we do. So we got a little laugh. We get to ramp it, and that's all. That's exactly what it's all about.
Remember, security fuels innovation. Complexity is the enemy, and collaboration is the way. Until next time.